So, or rye whiskey. So then in the 1880s, when blended whiskey was first discovered, so to speak, they started taking these whiskeys and blending them. He thought it was evil. It was adulteration, sin, because whiskey means pure whiskey or pure, and any blending then becomes evil and sinful and adulteration. It should be outlawed. He was in favor of outlawing blended whiskey. This schmuck. I mean, really kind of bizarre point of view, but it fits in with the definition. Somehow, a definition has to be fixed forever. It means you can't innovate. So you can't innovate in business. You can't have technological innovation in consumer brands or anything. If you never change the name always has to be whiskey means pure rye and it can't mean a blend. So this freezes the status quo. It means you can't compete. You can't innovate very well. And this of course, is the purpose of the whole thing. Anyway, on sugar, he says that the United States should be self-sufficient in sugar. He should outlaw sugar imports. He calls for a very high tariff on sugar imports. And notice there's very little sugar in the United States. Sugar, it's not economic to grow sugar in the United States. Essentially, it's much more economic to import sugar from the Dominican Republic and Cuba, Hawaii, which is then not U.S. property, etc., etc. He says, no, you have to have self-sufficiency in sugar. So he of course joins the Republican Party, because the Republican Party was the party of pietism and high tariffs. Okay? It immediately fits in beautifully with the Republican ideology. He becomes a state chemist for the state of Indiana, and he calls for passing a law regulating the manufacture and sale of chemical fertilizers, try to restrict that. And then he starts going into the sugar manufacturing business himself. He buys a defunct beet sugar plant, and tries to organize a glucose plant in Indiana. It always flops. The guy's a total flopperoo. Terrible entrepreneur. He tries to make sugar from sorghum cane. That doesn't work either. January 1883, by this time he's one of America's leading sugar chemists, and he gives a speech before the Indiana State Board of Agriculture. He says, quote, "The consumption of sugar is a measure of progress in civilization." He thundered, quote, "Childhood without candy would be heaven without harps," unquote. And then these days, of course, when everybody's anti-sugar, it brings a beautiful note. Childhood without candy would be heaven without harps. He then added, without any trace of irony, that nothing is ever gained for a cause by overstatement of its claims. He also kept pushing the idea of manufacturing sugar from sorghum, which is one of his big shticks. He flopped as an entrepreneur of this. He kept pushing that for many years, until it finally became a total flopperoo. He tried to get government aid and government subsidies for this and so forth and so on. At this point, the Federal Commission of Agriculture had one department, one agricultural chemist, and they fired him. He was an obstreperous, notorious character named Dr. Peter Collier. He was a big pro-sorghum fan, one of the specialized, subsidized sorghum. So the sorghum growers were apparently politically powerful, so when they kicked him out, they wanted to replace him with some guys also pro-sorghum, and they got Wiley in as the Department of Agriculture chemist, the chief chemist in 1883. He then takes over and becomes a federal government official from then on. So he immediately, of course, agitates for protective tariff for foreign sugar, subsidies for domestic sugar, and all that. He was asked, by the way, this question, interestingly, typical racist Republican at that time. He was asked, what would happen if foreign sugar growers, they were put out of work by a high American protective tariff? He said, the native, he said, quote, sullenly lolling in the sun, can look up and see coconuts and bananas. He will not starve nor freeze. let him eat coconuts. Typical attitude of the Republican Party toward the Third World period. And his scientific work for the Department of Agriculture, he spent most of his time and energy trying to subsidize the sugar industry. Searching for methods to produce sugar from sorghum, wasting on a lot of research funds in this effort, etc., etc. By the way, his sorghum experiments were constant flops, even though he's a big shot. Became more and more of a big shot during the 1880s. His experiments by trying to get sugar out of sorghum was constant flopperoos. This, by the way, often happens in the world. You'll find out people flop all the time, yet they keep rising in eminence as they flop. They become bigger shots with each failure. He got congressional appropriations all the time from Senator Plum of Kansas. Kansas had a lot of sorghum growers, and so of course he kept feeding Wiley funds to try to help out the sorghum people in Kansas, sorghum farmers. Anyway, but he kept growing in eminence, And when Cleveland came in 1884, he wasn't kicked out for some reason. He was Cleveland appointed Wiley's old friend as a commissioner of agriculture, and he got the guy to keep him in office, even though he was a Republican. And anyway, by the mid-1890s, it was clear to everybody, even Wiley, that sorghum was not the way out. You couldn't produce sugar from sorghum with any kind of economically. He blamed the misfires not on his own crazy schemes nor on his own consistent string of research failures. He didn't blame him on the subsidy or the whole idea. He blamed him on the fact that the sugar tariff wasn't high enough yet to keep increasing it, prohibit foreign sugar. So his other big shtick was, one, as I say, his big thing was to subsidize the American sugar industry and keep out foreign sugar. His other big thing was to outlaw impure products, what he called impure. And he meant things like, as I say, changing definitions, like blended whiskey was impure. He also was the main guy behind the outlawing of oleomargarine. Oleomargarine was a big new thing in the 1890s, let's say. Looks like butter, tastes like butter, is much cheaper. Therefore, of course, the butter interests, headed by the Wisconsin dairy people, wanted to outlaw it. Wiley, of course, leading the pack. It's an evil thing. It's adulteration. It's changing the definition. It's not really butter. You kind of confuse the public. And so they levied a special tax on oleomargarine. As a matter of fact, oleomargarine until the 1940s was illegal. You had to sell it white. You couldn't have it look like butter. And so you could buy margarine in the stores with a icky white sort of gray color. And along with it, you had a tube of yellow color. So you can squirt the yellow tube over it and make it look like butter. It was only since World War II, the power hold, the stranglehold of the butter interests, dairy interests was broken. We can have decent looking oleomargarine. I mean, it tasted okay, but it looked terrible, you say. And of course, the butter interests knew that. They wanted to keep it. Don't outlaw the idea of yellow oleomargarine. Of course, Wiley was leading the pack in this thing. So Wiley called for a National Pure Food and Drug Act, a pure food to outlaw these so-called impurities, outlaw changes, really. Competition with butter, competition with old products. But he was not alone. He was joined with this idea of a National Pure Food and Drug Act by a whole bunch, the whole organized retailer, organized wholesale grocers, organized retailers, organized food interests. For example, the National Grocers Association had a convention in 1888. They called for a law, quote, to protect the honest businessman from the competition of the adulterator. What they meant by adulterator was not poison or anything or fraudulent. They meant somebody who was new product, like oleomargarine. That's what they meant. The dairy producers said they wanted protection for such fraud as oleomargarine, and corn and hog grocers wanted protection against adulterated lard, as they called it. Different kinds of lard which competed with heavy butter fat lard, heavy greasy lard. And of course, so the dairy interests wanted to have this outlawing, the grocery interests, and intellectuals, technologists like Wiley, want to have cushy jobs for inspectors, for chemists, and would test and see whether it was adulteration, quote unquote. The adulterated lard, the law against adulterated lard passed the House, but it failed in the Senate because of the cottonseed oil interests who were making lard with cottonseed, new kind of lard, which is better and tastier or whatever it is, cheaper, whatever the thing is. And of course, so they managed to stop that. But at any rate, after many years of this agitation, with Teddy Roosevelt coming in, they finally got their way. This whole the farm interest, the grocery interest, the dairy interests, etc., plus Wiley and his technologists. By the way, speaking for one of these bills before the Franklin Institute scientific body, Dr. Wiley conceded that only a small part of food adulteration injured the consumers. He wasn't worried about that. He didn't say they poisoned the consumers. There's nothing to that, he said. He was more worried about the consumers spending their money in ways that he, Wiley, considered unwise. He was trying to defend our pocketbook. He said the poor were purchasing food, quote, was ostensibly pure and nutritious, but in reality valueless. And the idea is you outlaw food that technologists consider not valuable, like outlawing junk food. I knew kids in Virginia who were raised on Coca-Cola instead of milk. What are you going to do? Outlaw Coca-Cola, right? That seems to be the... So, but see, his concern for the consumer's pocketbook is very much like doctors, like physicians want to outlaw what they consider quack cures because the public is wasting their money on them. Not because it harms the public. They say they're wasting their money, not really valuable. Well, their concern for the consumer's pocketbook doesn't extend to their own money, of course. They want to be the only ones fattening on the consumer. They don't want any competition in raiding the consumer pocketbook. And so, in the name of helping the consumers, protecting him against oleomargarine, protecting him against Coca-Cola, whatever happens to be, against blended whiskey. The idea is to cartelize the existing status quo, freeze the status quo, so to speak. Yeah, as I say, he can widely consider it fraudulent to call blended whiskey whiskey. He said, no, the term whiskey must be confined to straight whiskey. It's impure. Beet Sugar Association, of course, they all love Wiley. All these guys, the sugar people, of course, are crazy about him. Anyway, when Teddy Roosevelt comes in, he of course pushes this, and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which Wiley had been agitating for 25 years or so, was finally passed. And of course, when it was passed, Roosevelt obviously appoints Wiley as the Food and Drug Commissioner, right? He's the agitator for that. And Wiley reaches the summit of existence in 1906 as our first Food and Drug Commissioner. The interesting thing is what happened. He gets his comeuppance, though, Wiley. He's kind of cute. Here he was a big sugar fan. I mean, as we know, his big love of his life. So the first thing that Wiley calls for after he gets to be commissioner of the Pure Food and Drug Commissioner is to outlaw saccharin. Because saccharin was, of course, the big competitor of sugar. And none of this nonsense about saccharin causing cancer then. The saccharin just didn't like saccharin because it was a competitor of sugar. He says, we have to outlaw saccharin. It's impure. It's adulterous. And it so turned out that Teddy Roosevelt used to take saccharin in his coffee every morning. He was one of the early saccharin people. So we had a big clash on this. And Teddy Roosevelt said, this guy's a nut. This guy Wiley's trying to outlaw my saccharin. So what he does is, not only does he appoints a higher board in the department to pass on this, Teddy Roosevelt, and a special dig on Wiley, he goes over Wiley's head and he appoints a new commission, a new board to decide these matters. As chairman of the board, he appoints Ira Remsen, the guy who discovered saccharin, the inventor or discoverer of saccharin, a special dig at Wiley. So Wiley gets his comeuppance at long last, and as I say, it was a great poetic justice for Wiley to be hoisted on the petard of saccharin, the big sugar thing. The biographer, if you're interested in reading about Wiley, there's an interesting biography of him by a guy named Anderson called Health of a Nation. Anderson, of course, loves Wiley. He thinks he's the greatest guy since Jesus, practically. But he had an interesting summation of Wiley. He said about Wiley, quote, science filled the void left by loss of faith. In other words, here he rose up as a pietist Campbellite. He loses his religion, but he becomes a salvation by science. Okay, science filled the void left by loss of faith. Perhaps Wiley's views stem from his heritage of evangelical Christianity, a heritage whose theological superstructure had lost its meaning for him, but whose burning zeal for social justice remained. I mean, he's crushing everybody else, imposing his power on everybody else through government. He can call that social justice. I've got another name for it. But anyway, that's the basic facts. And Wiley is really typical of all these guys, all these progressive intellectuals and technocrats. And it's a good case study. Okay, well, last time the National Civic Federation was the main organization, as Weinstein points out, which provided the impetus for what we can call corporatism, or the new dispensation of government-industry partnership, or government or welfare statism, or welfare warfare statism. It was first founded in Chicago, the Chicago Civic Federation, back in 1898, I think. And they had a conference on trusts, and was generally liked, etc., and finally became was organized in 1900 out of that Chicago conference. Went national, so to speak, to the National Civic Federation. And it was organized by Ralph Easley. He was a former school teacher and journalist and executive director of this outfit. Oddly enough, it's kind of interesting, the Chicago Civic Federation, which is the start of all this, first came about, began because of a very interesting Englishman, a very important English journalist named William T. Stead, who was the editor of the London Times, which still is, in those days, certainly was the most influential English organ, and sort of reflected government opinion. And he was the editor at that point of the Review of Reviews. He became head of editor of the London Times a little bit later. Anyway, he He was a big corporatist type. He was essentially a friend and disciple of Cecil Rhodes, who organized in those days, a secret Rhodes organization, Rhodes Fellowships and Rhodes Society, to push the idea, one, of the British Empire, and two, of general statism, capital government partnership and intervention. He's also a big, he came to Chicago, he's a big pietist, of course. He came to Chicago to denounce vice, gambling, and prostitution. And he, as we'll see a little bit later, this also comes in with urban progressive reform, a progressive period, big urban reform situation. I'm going to close that door. Who are these jerks? It's not a whole of higher learning. Okay. He was there to and we'll see, as I say, either today or probably the next time, that the urban reform comes along with this, along with the general corporatist welfare state idea, the idea of cleaning up the cities and essentially purging ethnic liturgicals and working class types and seizing control by pietist businessmen, upper class businessmen. The Weinstein book talks a lot about that, of course. We'll get into that a little bit later. Anyway, it was a mass meeting in November at Chicago Civic Center Club in November 1893, which Stead was railing against prostitution and vice, etc. And he formed the so-called Civic Church in London. And he tried to set the same thing up in Chicago, and they were interested in this. And they set up the Chicago Civic Federation as a result. The president of the Chicago Civic Federation was Lyman Gage, who later became Secretary of the Treasury, head of the First National Bank of Chicago, and a big Rockefeller person. In other words, you have to realize that Rockefeller was a dedicated Baptist all his life, and so this was fitted in very nicely with pietist concerns. And the secretary of this outfit was the same Ralph Easley, who later founded the National Civic Federation. So it gets its start in 1893, 1894, after Stead, First National Bank of Chicago. That was a guy named Gage who was the president of this thing, and Easley was the executive director. Gage later became Secretary of the Treasury under McKinley, and when McKinley became president. So, and another thing about Stead is that he was a disciple of John Ruskin, who was a big art critic and medieval socialist. And was somebody who was very, very pro-state, very anti-capitalist. Yeah. Yeah, that's the guy. No, this guy named Gage, excuse me. He was the president of the Chicago Civic Federation. Stead was an Englishman who simply inspired the Chicago Civic Federation. He spoke and so forth, and then he inspired these businessmen in Chicago to set up the Chicago Civic Federation to continue the great work that Stead had. Stead was like an evangelist. He comes to Chicago, he lifts everybody up, they form this organization, and he goes back to England. Okay. Yeah, sorry, that was... Stead was on the executive committee of Cecil Rhodes. What happened was at Oxford, Cecil Rhodes was also influenced by Ruskin and this idea of new form medieval socialism, so to speak. And Rhodes instead formed in 1891 a secret society called the Circle of Initiates, and which Rhodes was the leader and Stead was on the executive committee. And most powerful people in England became members of this group, this secret group, including Lord Rothschild, who essentially helped finance it. We now have the whole Rhodes, of course, is the big diamond magnate, so Rhodes helped finance it, and also Rothschild. They have a Rhodes-Rothschild secret society devoted to promoting British imperialism, number one, and two, statism. In other words, domestic statism, domestic welfare state control of industry, and so forth and so on. Anyway, the new economists, guys like Jenks, I've already mentioned, and Cummins, corporatist economists, spoke at this conference, the Chicago Civic Federation Conference in 1900, Conference on Trusts, and this inspired, the success of this inspired Easley and these guys to set up set up a national civic federation to push this thing on a large scale. They had in this National Civic Federation all the big business interests, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Rothschilds, the Belmonts, they're all involved in this thing. Because even though they had differences of opinion on what the state should do, what the government should do, they all agreed on government intervention as the key thing. For example, by 1903, it was only founded in 1900. By 1903, the National Civic Federation included representatives of 1/3 of all the large American corporations. In other words, all corporations that were over 300 that had more than $10 million of assets, 1/3 of them were involved in the National Civic Federation. George Perkins, of course, was heavily involved in it, being Morgan's main political person. And a whole bunch of people, Elihu Root, William Howard Taft, later president, Teddy Roosevelt, I think himself, was in it. The whole gang was in it. Everybody was in it. Anyway, there was a clash, interestingly, between them and the National Association of Manufacturers, which also started about the same time, which in those days was a small business group. Nowadays, of course, it includes large as well as small business. But the NAM began as a small business anti-union group, and they soon had big clashes, the NAM being much more of a laissez-faire outfit at the time. And Easley writes an interesting and revealing point. He says, he condemned the NAM. He said, our enemy, he says, our enemies, he writes this to a friend and supporter of the National Civic Federation. He says, quote, our enemies are the socialists among the labor people, it means the Marxists, etc., and the anarchists among the capitalists. What he meant by anarchists was the NAM. In other words, the laissez-faire advocates among capitalism, which he refers to as anarchists. So they saw themselves as a third force. And by the way, all the intellectuals saw themselves as this. On the one hand, you have laissez-faire, which they consider to be outmoded or too competitive or whatever. On the other hand, you had Marxian socialism, which was rising up in Europe, which they were against because it was essentially, of course, worker proletarian-oriented, allegedly anyway. So they saw themselves, these people, as the third force between Marxism, Leninism on the one hand and laissez-faire capitalism on the other. This is the third way. The way of government-industry cooperation, of cartelization, of general monopoly, of corporatism, as we can call it. And this idea is now in the air. It's being held by the Morgans, even by the Rockefeller, most big businessmen in the United States, and also in Western Europe. And we have to realize that the same sort of thinking is going on in England and France and Germany, etc. That we have a third way, and a way which instead of having class struggle, you don't have laissez-faire competition, and you don't have class struggle by proletariat against capitalists. What you have is the nation, the organic nation, headed by the strong state, running everything, healing everything, collaborating, molding all forces together, headed by big government, the king, the president, or whoever happens to be, and collaborating through associations of businessmen, associations of unions, associations of intellectuals to run the system. Essentially the corporate state, as Mussolini would later call it. So this idea is now in the air in Western Europe and the United States. I mentioned before it really starts in Germany with Bismarck and the German cartelists, the first real modern compulsory cartel system in the 1870s and 80s, where all the firms are forced into a cartel association, are forced to abide by the state-dominated price and production decision, the cartels run by the German government. And the intellectuals at the time, the German professors who were handing out the PhDs that American graduate students were going to, were calling themselves, Gustav Schmuller, the famous professor of history and economics at the University of Berlin, said very proudly, we at the University of Berlin, our function is to be the intellectual bodyguard of the House of Hohenzollern. In other words, the intellectual bodyguard of the emperor, of the dynasty. So there's a very frank statement. In other words, the function of intellectuals is the apologists for the government, apologists for the state. The state is supposed to be absolute, running everything, interfering in everything, controlling everything. And the function of the intellectual is to propose it, to propagandize for it, apologize for it, and help run it. This is the great blend of throne and altar again. I don't know if I mentioned this last time. What you have throughout history, you have the throne and altar. You have the king and the government, the president, whoever that happens to be, running everything politically, taxing, controlling, building up power, etc. And the church or the intellectuals apologizing for it, helping to plan it, and getting part of the loot in return from the state. In the case, of course, the new guilds coming out, intellectuals and technocrats, they also get restricting entry into the field, restricting entry into medicine, into engineering, whatever, to law, to increase their income through state privilege. We'll talk about medicine a little bit later on, how the thing works in medicine. It's a real scandal. This is what happened in 1910 with the famous Flexner Report, which totally transformed the medicine in the United States. At any rate, in the case of unions, of course, the laissez-faire people are against unions. The National Civic Federation were in favor of unions. We've already seen that unions hardly existed except in craft unions, except in small building trades and small craft unions. The National Civic Federation people had a different vision. They believe in large unions. They wanted big unionism so as to run the labor force, the organized labor force, in collaboration with big business and big government. In other words, to be sort of like the transmitting orders to the working class, so to speak. And so really, in World War I, as we'll see, the federal government essentially created mass unionism in the United States, almost de novo through World War I collectivist, through orders of World War I collectivism. Another thing that unions help do is to cartelize the system. For example, to leap ahead a bit, in the 1930s, when the Wagner Act brought into effect mass industrial unionism in the United States, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers Union, the bituminous coal industry, what he essentially did was he essentially understood about the demand curve and went up it. In other words, you have the demand curve for labor, and this is wage rates, and this is quantity of labor hired. He understood if you increase, you jack up wage rates, you will disemploy a whole bunch of people. He was in favor of it. He didn't care. But Lewis's view is, what you do is you jack up wage rates for these union workers with seniority, people in the coal mines who had like 20 years seniority. That's all he cared about, to maximize their income. He didn't care about the unemployment for the younger workers and for those who were coming up, people who were growing up and wanting to be coal miner people. He collaborated with the coal mining industry because they collaborated in the idea of pushing up wage rates so as to essentially put out of business all the smaller coal mines who were higher cost coal mines, and if they were competitors, we put out of business through increasing wage rates. So what you had, in other words, was a cartelization through the industrial unions, or industry-wide union, deliberately putting out of business a whole bunch of coal miners for the benefit of the employers, the large coal miners, and causing unemployment for the younger coal workers without seniority. And John L. Lewis understood this fairly well and did it. In other words, it was a pure monopolistic or cartelist act on his part, along with the mine industry. See, it's often thought by many people that unions and businesses are always clashing, but they're not necessarily clashing. Sometimes they have common interests, such as screwing the smaller coal mines and that sort of thing. It's the same way with the Teamsters Union, for example. The Teamsters Union bitterly fought the idea of trucking deregulation a few years ago. And when deregulation came in 1978, the Teamsters fought it along with the large trucking people. Fought the idea of deregulation. They didn't want to have small trucks coming in, see, mom and pop trucks, because they obviously are not going to join a union. So they fought bitterly against it. It was a mighty collaboration between the large trucking interests and the Teamsters Union. So this happens all the time. You should understand that, understand the way the real world works. So at any rate, as a part of this drive, the National Civic Federation starts pushing for workmen's compensation laws. It needs to be very progressive. If a worker gets injured on the job, the government should pay for it through this alleged insurance or whatever, through the various firms kicking into a fund. Yeah. They promoted unions. They also promoted workmen's compensation laws. Right? You probably did. I don't really know that much about British history. I think they had. I don't know if they had the exact. The name wasn't the same, but probably the same sort of thing. I would think so. Yeah. 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 I'm trying. Well, what happened in the coal industry is that there's a special situation with after World War I. After World War I, it was really wacky because the pound sterling was always $4.87. It had been for 100 years. When World War I comes, there was general inflation. Everybody goes off the gold standard and inflates in order to pay for the war effort. Every country, including the United States, which only partially went off the gold standard. But at any rate, at the end of course, we only were at war for 18 months. In Europe, they were at war for 4 years. At the end of the war, by 1920 or so, the pound had sunk on the free market to about 320. Everybody wanted to get back to the gold standard. It was generally agreed to have a sound international financial system that should go back to the gold standard. The rational thing would have been done for England to cut their losses and say, okay, the pound is depreciated from 487 to 320. They go back to the gold standard at 320. Okay, that's it. That would have been perfect. Nothing would have been, no problem, would have been great. Instead of that, these jerks, and one of the craziest, wackiest, and most unproductive or counterproductive decisions of 20th century history, said we have to go back to the gold standard at the original par 487. Because that's the way it always was. London was always 487. The pound must be preserved. The old pound must be restored. And also they felt the prestige of the pound, and they wanted to reestablish London as the great financial center of the world because the United States, New York was coming up fast. In order to do that, they insisted on going back to 487. A totally wacky and nutty decision. And no economist, I don't think any economist in England said, let's go back to 320. Some said we should have irredeemable paper money. Others, but most of them said we have to go back to 487. They all fell for this nonsense. So in other words, this meant, of course, that British exports, if you go back at 487, British exports are now unsellable because they're now at a very high price. You're going back at a highly overinflated pound. Okay? It means a product which would be, let's say, a loaf of whatever it is, one widget, which would originally cost $320 in the United States, would now cost $487 because they're going back to this highly overvalued pound. So, in other words, it's a very deflationary decision. In order to make this viable, it means they have to have internal deflation. They have to contract the money supply and lower domestic prices so as to make the exports competitive. The major export is coal, and the other one is textiles, how I got into this thing, because coal is their big export, coal and textiles. So in other words, they deliberately placed a tremendous burden on the coal industry and on the textile industry because they were now uncompetitive. They would have had to have deflation. They didn't want deflation. They wanted to inflate. So here the British government insists, one, on going back to a pound, very overvalued pound, which would have required a big deflation to have the exports competitive. Instead of that, they inflate. So they're totally screwed up. They have a totally, very, very odd situation. In order to make this sustainable, they have to try to get so in other words, England had a depression all during the 1920s. Everybody else had a big boom in the 20s. England had a big depression, heavy unemployment, especially in coal and textiles, in the export industry. And the way they try to solve this is to force everybody else to inflate, so they wouldn't lose gold. Force the United States to induce the United States to inflate. Couldn't force us. They suckered us into it through the Morgan connection, JP Morgan connection. The countries in Europe, which they ran through the League of Nations, they forced to inflate. Bulgaria and all these countries, they literally arm twisted to get them to inflate so that England would gain exports. It was a horrible situation, self-defeating, and precipitated finally the collapse in 1931 with the whole British pound goes bankrupt and they go off the gold standard and they have a big depression. But anyway, it all starts with this idiotic decision to go back at 487. Within that framework, they handle things very shrewdly, so given the crazy situation. The unions work. But what happened? See, the unions, unionism came about in England during World War I because of massive unemployment insurance, where unemployment insurance was almost equivalent to the wage rate. So if you had a wage rate of $10, $3 an hour, you got an unemployment insurance of $3 an hour for a long, long time, which helped the union sustain a high wage, excessively over market wage rate. What you have to realize is unemployment insurance and welfare also, what they do is subsidize unemployment. They create unemployment, basically, what they do. They prevent pressure of the unemployed upon union wage rates or minimum wage rates. So anyway, that was the coal situation. So anyway, they pushed for workmen's compensation laws, looking very progressive and humanitarian. What it really meant was to put burdens on smaller firms, which just to write out to pay fixed costs, to write out the forms and everything, as an excessive cost burden on the smaller competitors of these bigger businesses. So in the name of humanitarianism, you again help to cartelize the system by placing high costs on small firms. For example, take the liquor industry. The liquor industry is always complaining about high taxes, and properly so. However, the liquor industry is in favor of very high taxes on stills. In other words, you pay essentially a fixed cost, a fixed fee per still. It was distillery of liquor. So if you pay a fixed cost, whatever the fixed cost is, let's say $5,000 a still. I don't know what it is, let's see, something like that. This means, of course, Seagram's can pay it pretty easily, or Jack Daniels, but Hiram Jones in West Virginia can't pay it. He only makes about $2,000 a year. He can't pay a $5,000 a year fee. This drives Hiram Jones into illegal moonshine production. In other words, the moonshiners are a product of this fixed fee by which the big liquor companies squeeze the smaller firms out of business. They have high fixed costs per distillery, per still, deliberately done in order to screw the poor small competitors, the poor moonshiners, and then force them into illegal production. So in other words, what you have to look at the welfare state, we'll be giving, most of the rest of the term will be examples of this. In other words, examples of situations where alleged welfare state situation where big business gets together to impose government regulation in order to screw their smaller competitors, to drive smaller competitors out of business one way or the other. Either officially drive them out of business, like medical licensing, or imposing high fixed costs on them one way or the other. Anyway, National Civic Federation, what they would do is they would push for this. They would write a model law. In other words, their experts would help write a model workman's compensation law, and then they start lobbying for it in every state. And state governments, of course, like this because they get, the work is cut out for them. They don't have to write the legislation. It's written for them by the National Civic Federation. They just adopt it. So another reason for this is the liability question. And the common law, if you're a worker and you get an accident on the job, your employer is liable only if the worker himself is not responsible, or if another worker is not responsible, or employer is not liable if you voluntarily assume the risk. In other words, if you're a high wire construction person and you fall off, you obviously know you've assumed the risk. You know what's going on. The employer is not liable. So in this kind of common law structure, usually most accidents employers were not liable. Well, the government started changing the laws about 1900 so as to make employers liable for more and more accidents. As a result, the employers started pushing for workmen's compensation legislation so they wouldn't be liable. Then they let the fund pay for it. So that was another reason for it. At any rate, another aspect of progressive reform I want to mention is the so-called public utility question. Again, this is for many years, up until very recently, this is part of it was considered that public utilities have to be either government-run or government-monopolized because it's a natural monopoly, as it's called. Natural monopoly is gas and electric. It's not a natural monopoly. It's a lot of nonsense. There's no reason why Con Ed has to have a monopoly of all electricity sold in the city of New York. Columbia University, for example, generates its own electricity. That's legal. You can have your own generator for your own building. It's illegal, however, for Columbia University to sell electricity to the guy across the street, even though probably they could do it cheaper than Con Ed. It's illegal because Con Ed has a territorial monopoly on all sales of electricity and gas. So, also, of course, this restricts all kinds of technological innovation. If Con Ed has a monopoly on all New York City electricity, it means there's no incentive for anybody to discover a way to have better, more efficient, decentralized electricity because it's illegal. Even if they could, most people are not going to waste their time trying to invent something which turns out to be illegal. So, at any rate, the idea of monopoly privileges for public utilities only comes in the progressive era. It's not eternal. It comes in about 1900, 1905. It first was established by the National Civic Federation and a Commission on Public Ownership of Public Utilities. And the idea is this is true for trolleys, buses, gas and electric, and of course telephones. The idea is this: you create a monopoly privilege by the government. Nobody else can compete in this area. Okay, and then you set the rates. You regulate the rates so as to guarantee a certain fixed rate of profit. Try to guarantee it anyway. The rates are based. The rate of profit is based on the value of capital. So let's say it's 8%. Let's say the capital invested in this electric company is $1 million, and you set the rate so as to give a 80,000 profit, right? $80,000 a year profit. The higher the value of the capital, the higher the government fixes the rate. the Public Utility Commission fixes the rate. So it's the interest of each firm, each electricity firm or trolley firm or whatever, to keep the value of the capital as high as possible. So the government will then jack up the rate. Well, the value, on orthodox accounting principles, the value of capital is based on how much the firm paid for a certain equipment or plant. So if you pay a lot of money for the equipment, it's fixed at that price, and if you don't depreciate it much, it just stays there. You can set the rate on that basis. As a result, Con Ed, for example, never depreciates their capital. They try not to depreciate their capital at all. They keep the capital value, because if you depreciate, it means the value of the capital goes down. They have to lower their rates. It's a totally crazy system. Most firms, for example, like IBM, is depreciating all the time. They want to depreciate very fast, so they get a lot of funds. They can plow back money into new equipment, so it won't be obsolete. But Con Ed, or AT&T before deregulation, they weren't interested in depreciation, because if they depreciated, they have to lower the value of their capital, and the government's rates would go down. I mean, the rates the government set would go down. So as a result, Con Ed almost never depreciates. Con Ed is still hanging on 1910 equipment, because if they depreciate the equipment, the official orthodox accounting value of that capital goes down. They have to lower their rate. So that's why that's one of the reasons why you have these damn blackouts all the time. Con Ed is operating an equipment 60 years old. It's their economic interest to do so. Contrast to free market firms, where the interest is to keep up with competition and get as innovative as possible. Not if you're a regulated monopoly like the public utility system. Stress today the fact that progressivism goes not just on the federal level, as we've been talking about, but also on the state and local level. The whole revolution in the United States, state and local, as well as federal regulation. Last time I mentioned public utilities. There's no reason why public utility has to be monopolistic, or there's no natural monopoly. If there is such, it should come about naturally, not by government fiat. What happened was the utilities began to realize this was a good thing and get a monopoly franchise for 20 or 50 years duration or something, and get the utility commission to grant a cost plus or a profit, set the rate at a return which would guarantee a profit on its capital investment. And this was pushed by the National Civic Federation and other organizations, electrical utility manufacturers, for example, to push for government monopoly, so-called public utility regulation, or public utility status. One of the first guys on this, coming to this conclusion, was Charles Yerkes, who was a big Chicago traction magnate, which meant essentially bus and trolley. He came to the conclusion he'd be more profitable with a government monopoly than a free market company. So so what he did is he found out that he couldn't, he would get monopoly for 20 years monopoly, but he found out he had a whole bunch of monopoly franchises and trolleys, etc. But each time he had to bribe the city councilman to give them every time it got renewed. And so every couple of years they'd have a new set of bribes. In other words, a renewal would come up, and he couldn't float 20-year bonds because the bondholders couldn't be guaranteed that he'd keep getting this monopoly status. So what he did is he had some bills introduced in the Illinois legislature in 1897. Be a premature person here, which would extend the beginning of the progressive movement, so quote unquote progressive movement in utility franchises. Instead of having a 20-year monopoly, have a 50-year monopoly, and have instead of having the city council set the rates would be set by quote nonpartisan unquote state utility commission, which would be objective and scientific and blah blah blah. This is, by the way, as we'll see today, one of the big goals of progressivism in economics and industry is to quote take something out of politics unquote. In other words, take blank out of politics. You can fill in the blanks: electric utilities, telephones, post office, almost anything can be taken out. Transportation. Taking out of politics means that the government runs it, or runs it in connection with a monopoly company, without any public, without any check by the taxpayers or the voters, because it then becomes a sort of hermetically sealed outfit. Yeah, the tally. AT&T was indeed a monopoly, right? It was also a monopoly. It was put in by the federal government. Federal Communications Commission was regulating it. It was a guaranteed monopoly. It was allegedly because telephones are supposed to be a natural monopoly. And that's the only case. There might have been a case for that in 1890, although even then you couldn't really. I mean, if something is a natural monopoly, let it be formed naturally, not by government coercion. Okay? The argument was, if you've seen movies about 1900, I mean, movies about that period in Mexico, they have everybody has 10 phones on their desk with their 10 different phone companies. Okay. Well, I mean, so it's more convenient to have one phone company. On the other hand, of course, phone companies can interlock with each other. There's nothing to prevent them from calling on each other's line, having an interconnecting cable. That's okay, but see, it's free competition within that. In other words, it's like using a public road in a sense. You pay a fee on the same line. It doesn't really make any difference. You can have competition anyway. Although one of the problems with the AT&T monopoly, not only to prevented other companies from producing phones, for example, and data interconnect. When the monopoly was eliminated about 15 years ago, it gave rise to an entire new industry called the data interconnect industry. All these different phone systems, first within each corporation, closed circuit TV from New York, Chicago. It was all prohibited because of the damn monopoly, and that eliminating that monopoly, gave rise to this whole industry. Also, you could have other communication systems where couldn't occur because there was it was illegal. Technologically, you can eventually have you can have all sorts of phone type of communication type systems, like TV, face-to-face TV from different cities and stuff like that. All sorts of things could happen. Once you eliminate the monopoly, you allow that to take place. So you might have eventually, I don't know, you could go into some phone booth and call somebody up and have a face-to-face TV conversation. It's technologically feasible, just not much in demand yet. And all sorts of stuff could occur, and satellite communication, God knows what else, except it was prohibited by the AT&T monopoly. Fortunately, that's now over. Unfortunately, they went too far. Not only did they eliminate the monopoly, they also broke up AT&T. There's no reason for that. Breaking up, the New York phone system and the AT&T system, preventing the same outfit from having a local and interstate phone. No reason for that. That was just destruction on behalf of a crazy economic theory. Yeah, they wanted to have they want to be able to have both systems. This is forcing you to have another company, even if you don't want it. Most people would be happy to continue with AT&T, both domestic and interstate. They just can't do it because AT&T is not allowed to participate in local phone stuff anymore. So that went too far. That was the antitrust stuff. But the real thing that liberated the phone industry was eliminating the FCC monopoly about 10, 15 years ago. So, at any rate, so of course now you can have hundreds of phone conversations on the same cable. There's no reason not to have it. Technologically, it's very easy. You don't have to have 50 different phones. So what Yerkes wanted to do, as I say, is to set up a quote nonpartisan commission and have a 50-year monopoly for his company, so he wouldn't have to keep bribing the city councilman every couple of years. It would have reduced his bribery costs. However, he came a cropper because he didn't. Part of the mystique of urban progressivism, as we'll see in a minute, attack so-called corruption. And he was, of course, attacked as being a corrupter and a bribery type. So his bill was defeated in 1897, only to be resurrected as a so-called progressive tactic 10 years later. So learning from Yerkes' abortive program, Samuel Insull, later was accused of being a crook in the late 1920s, probably unfairly. Samuel Insull starts the idea of progressivism, learning from Yerkes. Yerkes is his mentor in Chicago. Starts the idea of monopoly monopoly public utilities. In his presidential address before the National Electric Light Association, June 8, 1998, he urged his fellow electric utility magnates to get the industry regulated by state commissions with full power to fix rates and quality of service. And he said, he stressed the government's rate-making power rather than the monopoly, although monopoly was there. He was more sensitive to public relations than poor Yerkes was. It was obviously just all out to bribe. Most of the utilities magnates said, no, it's a terrible thing, it's violating laissez-faire, but he got a few supporters and he set up an association, committee on legislative policy. And he got in charge of Chicago Edison and Commonwealth Electric and was pushing this. And of course, as I say, in about 10 years, this became the general public utility doctrine. And once again, Wisconsin, National Civic Federation, Wisconsin was a leader in this whole state progressivism, including public utility monopoly, headed by the Wisconsin economist Richard T. Ely, who's the big so-called progressive, John R. Commons as a disciple, a whole bunch of them, but these are the main economists, and pushing the so-called Wisconsin idea, which Wisconsin progressivism across the whole state. Ely was also a big shot pietist type, post-millennial pietist. In other words, he believed that the way to achieve salvation is through first the government first we have to have a millennium, and then Jesus will come. And this means again that and he does it through government action. A great quote from Ely is that government is God's major instrument of redemption. In other words, you achieve salvation through government action, through government control, etc., etc. Commons was his disciple, student, and so forth and so on. Now here's Weinstein, I'm quoting now from the book, what you should have read, but anyway, Weinstein quotes about public utility. It's a good quote. He says, by 1909, many industry people, that's in public utilities, have begun to look favorably on regulation by state commissions and to understand the advantages of taking utilities regulation out of politics. Once again, taking out of politics means that you have your own kept board, a so-called nonpartisan board to do it, and not really regulated by the people. For example, the Postal Service has been taken out of politics. We used to have a post office. The head of the post office used to be the chairman of the Democratic or Republican National Committee, a big politician, and he staffed the post office with all his tools. That's the way most of the patronage jobs at the local level were postmasters. You're a loyal Democrat or a loyal Republican, you have to be a postmaster. Well, in order to fix up the post office every year has had a deficit. The post office, of course, also is the only outfit I can think of in the United States where not only does the price go up every year, but the quality of the service goes down. Usually in private industry, even if the price goes up because of inflation, at least the service goes up. The quality goes up. In the Postal Service, every year the quality is going down. Every year it takes longer and longer to get a letter delivered. When I was growing up in the 1930s, we used to get two mails a day, 2 deliveries a day, every apartment, every house. 2 a day without fail. Now you're lucky if it's 1 a day. And Saturday, often they drop out, things like that. So it takes longer and longer for a letter to be sent, as you well know. It used to be, when I was growing up, within New York City, the price was 2 cents a stamp. So it makes like, say, 16 cents now. It would be equivalent to an 8-fold increase in prices. 3 cents a stamp for regular first-class mail. Of course, now it's much higher. Not only is it much higher, but the service is worse. We used to have air mail as a special thing. That's been eliminated. Now everything goes by air, and therefore everything is slower. A few years ago, in order to dramatize the inefficient postal service here, some guy took a letter in Philadelphia and rode a horse from Philadelphia, dressing up in a Paul Revere uniform, and rode a horse to Washington and delivered the letter by hand from the horse. It took about 10 hours, something like that. Dramatizing the fact, it takes about 2 weeks to get by high-speed electronic postal service. So a few years ago, the Postal Service, in order to, quote, make it more efficient, unquote, they took it out of politics. They created the Postal Service on a so-called business basis, which means the Congress can't do anything about it. You can't get to it. In other words, you seal off the funds, you seal off the administration, and from then on, even the voters and the taxpayer can't do much about it. It's hermetically sealed off. It's called taking it out of politics. making it a, quote, business-like basis. So the voters can't get to it. Same thing was done with the Transportation Authority in New York. This miserable, rotten subway system was taken out of politics about 20 years ago. They set up the Transit Authority, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, on a so-called business-like basis. It means the state legislature and the voters can't get to it. It's sealed off. It's an oligarchically self-run oligarchy. And the first payment goes to the bondholders. By the way, what happened was they nationalized the subway system, municipalized in the 1930s, took it over. It was losing money because the government was fixing the fare 5 cents. And of course, this has been fixed at 5 cents since 1900. So they were losing money as prices went up, costs went up. And the government then, city government took over the subways, that means IRT and BMT, at a very high price, big subsidy to the stockholders. The stockholders loved it. And then they became New York City bondholders who then got first lien on every subway revenue. In other words, the first guys who get paid off, even if there's a big subway deficit, the bondholders get paid off the top. And they get paid off an increasingly higher rate because the interest rates in those days were like 3%. Now, of course, they refinance, the bonds refinance at 12% or something. So you get the city subway riders and bus riders are in total hock of these bondholders from the last 50 years. This is called putting out of business. This is called taking the subway system out of politics. At any rate, continue on. The underlying principles of the regulatory legislation supported responsible private ownership, and the experts appointed to the new commissions were almost invariably conservative in that they did not question the framework of the utilities industry. The result, therefore, was to introduce stability in the industry and to, quote, raise public morality, unquote, through the removal of discriminatory rates. It means removal of competition, as we well know now. The electric utility industry was the major, and the trolleys were the major backers of this. By the fall of 1913, Ralph Easley, the head of the National Civic Federation, wrote to President Seth Low, president of the National Civic Federation, at the great success of the drive for public utilities regulation. 25 years ago, he exulted, we would have regarded this as a species of socialism, unquote. But now, utilities are submitting, with many railways even embracing regulation, joyfully. Okay, so this is this joyful regulation. In other words, businessmen became more and more to see the monopolistic advantages of this kind of regulation. Okay, in the National Civic Federation, all the big shots, all the Morgan himself, the Morgan Partners, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Charles Francis Adams, the whole Mark Hanna, the whole gang was involved in this thing. Plus the politicians, Cleveland Taft, Teddy Roosevelt, Elihu Root, and Samuel Gompers of the AFL. Everybody was involved in this thing. It was one big happy family of the top, George Perkins, of course, the top corporate and leadership and union leadership. As I guess I already quoted Easley saying, our enemies are the socialists among the labor people and the anarchists among the capitalists. That means the laissez-faire types. Okay, now get to and workmen's compensation, again, was also pushed by the same people. When I get to the local government, well, here's a great quote, I can't avoid this, from the National Civic Federation. Frank Muncie, the publisher of Harper's Publishing Company and Harper's Magazine, wrote a letter to Teddy Roosevelt in January 1912, and he said, quote, it is the work of the state, that means the government, it is the work of the state to think for the people and plan for the people, to teach them how to do, what to do, and to sustain them in the doing. It's the function of the government to run everything. And this is a typical corporatist, state corporatist, progressive at work. When we get to local government, again, the theme is local and state government, to take everything out of politics. When I was growing up in the 1930s, the big slogan was, it doesn't matter whether a Republican or Democrat gets elected because there's no such thing as a Republican or Democratic way of sweeping the streets. So, in other words, all problems become technical. There are no political problems anymore, no value problems. Everybody's supposed to agree on all values. So all matters of at least local government become technical. And if all matters are technical and not valuational, not political, who should take care of them but technocrats, economists, social workers, engineers, etc., etc. This leaves a power vacuum for these guys to take over and run everything. On the basis of so-called non-political there's no such thing as non-political government. That's the whole point I'm trying to make here. What they're trying to do is to take government out of politics, is what it really amounts to. They don't quite say that because it sounds too idiotic. But basically what they're doing, what the progressive dream is, to take all government decisions out of politics, make it scientific, quote unquote. And they, of course, if it's scientific, it means that the bureaucrats run it. It means the taxpayer pays up, everything is monopolized in the name of so-called efficiency or so-called non-profit or non-partisan. Everything becomes non-partisan, street sweeping, local government. All these things become allegedly only technical problems. They're not technical problems, they're all value problems. Government is political, period. Citizens are not engineers, they're not garbage disposal experts. So if all government decisions are scientific or technological, it means there's no room for voting. The public is not supposed to vote, they're just supposed to ratify the decisions of the technocrats. So this whole thing is an ideological, deeply ideological doctrine in the name of non-ideology by the progressives. And it comes at a time, remember, when after 1896, there was no laissez-faire political party. The political parties themselves were becoming unimportant. There was no choice, no real ideological choices anymore after 1900. And so this leaves a power vacuum for the progressive technocrats and big business types, their allies, to take over. In local government, this meant, well, and generally it meant trying to play down and minimize the decisions of the voters, and minimize the role of voters. So how do you do that? Because voters can be, of course, they're not part of this whole clique. Voters can be disruptive. Voters can be a pain in the neck. They can dislodge all these technocratic decisions. Therefore, you try to play down the role as far as possible. First of all, by making the two parties about the same as they were after 1900, basically. Both centrist statists. In other words, neither very fanatical, but both basically progressive. Both in favor of a corporate state, or state corporate capitalism, whatever we're going to call it. So you minimize the role of voters by having both parties about the same. Okay, that's been achieved, more or less. And you also minimize the amount of the range of votes. For example, part of the progressive drive after 1900 was the so-called short ballot movement. In the old days, people used to vote on every office, like 100 different. You have a ballot, and you have 100 different things you can vote on. The idea of the short ballot movement, people don't know how to vote. Therefore, you should limit their voting to the top of the ticket: governor, lieutenant governor, blah blah blah. More or less, this has been achieved. You have very little to vote on anymore. And even now, we can vote on judges, and the technocrats are trying to get rid of that. They're always saying the public is not qualified to vote on judges, therefore they shouldn't do it. The judges should be appointed by the bar association or whatever. The public should only vote for the governor who appoints judges. You see, this is the doctrine, allegedly scientific doctrine. What it really is to minimize the scope of the public and have any choice at all. It's true that judges are experts and the public isn't. On the other hand, the judges rule over the public. The public should have some kind of a role in picking them, therefore. We're choosing our rulers, so to speak. It's not just like choosing a lawyer or engineer in the abstract. So the short ballot movement, in the name of expanding democracy, in the name of giving the public, having the public a better choice or something like that, essentially restricting democracy by shortening the ballot. Another thing that happened was the arrival of the so-called Australian ballot. Before that, this is by 1900, before that the ballot was secret, but what you did is everybody distributed their own ticket. In other words, let's say there's 6 candidates for an office. Each candidate has his own ticket, his own color, let's say. If I'm running for governor on the independent labor ticket, let's say, I distribute green tickets. And you take whichever ticket you want and put it in the box. There was no official ballot. So what the Australian ballot did is, in the name of so-called reform, it eliminated that. The ballots are now supplied only by the government. In other words, the government has a ballot like that. And the government restricts the number of names on it. So if you're in a third party, let's say, if you're any third party, and you're trying to get on the ballot, it's a big headache to get on it. You have to get 10,000 signatures to petition, blah, blah, blah. In the old days, you didn't have to there was no single ballot. So this means a government monopoly ballot, and thereby restricts voting to basically the two major parties. It's very difficult for any third party to get on now, because Because the government, since the government runs the ballot and decides who gets on it, it makes the decisions as to, you know, signatures and all that. And they try to raise it as much as possible. Each state is different. Yeah. No, shortening ballot is keeping the ballot minimal. In other words, shortening the ballot means shortening the number of electoral offices, increasing the number of appointed offices. Okay, in other words, shortening the number of elections. Okay, in other words, see, in the old days, as I say, the public used to vote on, say, 50 different jobs, let's say. Now it's only like 5. All of us are now appointed by the governor or whatever, or the mayor, or something like that. So you eliminate the number of elective offices. So, all right, you have a government monopoly ballot. You also have registration requirements. There were no registration requirements in the old days. In the old days, everybody could vote. All you do is you say, my name is Rothbard, I live on a certain address, and I vote, period. You didn't have to, there's no registration. Okay? Registration came in as a deliberate attempt to restrict particularly city voters. When, for example, in New York, the first registration requirements were only for New York City. Rural people, upstate, they didn't have to register. The idea is to restrict evil voters in New York City. In other words, ethnic, liturgical voters, is what it amounts to. This is part of the WASP pietist move for domination. So registration requirements come in to reduce the number of voters. Remember I talked about how the Republicans try to restrict immigration. Well, this is one way to do it. If you don't want to restrict immigration, you also restrict the number of people who can vote by registration requirements, and also eliminate alien votes. In the old days, aliens could vote. There was no restrictions. You didn't have to be a citizen to vote. Of course, this is now eliminated, so only citizens can vote. And then the increase in the amount of time you have to spend before you become a citizen. All this is to reduce the amount of voting. Only citizens can vote. So these are deliberate attempts to restrict democratic choice, is what it amounts to limit it, to make the ballot short, to have a monopoly ballot, to have registration requirements, to eliminate alien voters. So this is very cunning, because at the same time they claim they're expanding democracy by having the primary system. There's a lot of discussion now in political scientists about this, because it's become pretty obvious what's happened. In the old days, when political parties were important, okay, the political parties then chose their own candidates, Democrats, Republicans, whatever, and chosen either by convention or by state committee vote. Didn't make any difference. But this meant that only a party activist could vote. The party activists were the party members, and activists were the ones who chose the candidate. The primary system, compulsory primaries, which is a progressive move, allegedly to expand American democracy. Okay? And now, of course, we have primaries for everything. This is supposed to make everything much more democratic, but it really doesn't, because it means that any schmo can vote in a Democrat or Republican ticket. All you have to do is to sign up as a Democrat or Republican. You don't have to be an actual activist member. So this means anybody can get the nomination. It means that nomination is decided by public relations, by TV ads, by money, whatever it is. It means that the role of the party as such, the party as a mechanism for gathering, collecting ideas and principles, gets eliminated. The political party is now just a shell. Democrats and Republican Party don't mean anything. It's all, because of the compulsory primary system, it's all up for grabs. And this is now admitted by most political scientists. It's a terrible thing. They think it all came in the 1960s. It really started coming in 1900 with the whole primary concept. And this was deliberately done to destroy the role of the political party as an ideological and vote-gathering movement. In other words, as a group which means something. The idea is to make the parties meaningless and leave a power vacuum for technocrats and progressive, so-called non-partisan scientists. This is all accomplished. It was all done very cleverly. And one of the things they try to do most is to eliminate the Great War on the cities. By this time, the cities are almost all ethnic. In other words, the cities are mostly liturgical, mostly Irish and Italian and Polish, etc. And the rural areas are mostly WASP. I'm getting them out of the point where this is more and more true. And so the big cities become a focus of attack by WASP pietists as being sinful per se, as being nests of evil and sin. The whole rural versus urban thing really comes in about this time as an attack on urban ethnics. And one of the things which become most important now, again, for WASP proprietors is to smash the saloon, so have prohibition, to eliminate the saloon as a political and a political power of ethnic politics. Since most Italian, Irish, etc., Catholic people, the neighborhood saloon still is the focus of politics. And most of the socializing gets done in the saloon, and the saloon keeper becomes the ward healer, becomes the political power. You ask who to vote for. And so if you outlaw that, you can smash liturgical politics. So prohibition gets restored now as a big objective. Another thing to do is to try to eliminate city voting altogether. To eliminate the mayor and put in the non-political, quote-unquote, city manager. This is the result of this kind of so-called city manager movement, or city commission movement. Very powerful. It took over most of the small cities in the United States. It didn't win out in New York or Philadelphia or Boston, but in most of the small cities, Dayton, Ohio, and most of the Galveston, Texas, they now have city managers. The city manager gets a high salary. The mayor gets almost no salary. The mayor gets $20 a year or something. The mayor, therefore, has very little power. The city manager's in there full time, gets his own bureaucracy in there, and runs everything to his own, mostly to his own liking. Again, this is the political power by the bureaucrat, by the technocrat bureaucrat, taking over from the voters. Voters have almost no say in this anymore. It's eliminated. Very indirect. Another thing that happens is the nationalization of the public school system. The public schools, until about 1900, were essentially, first of all, they were not compulsory outside New England and Yankee areas. In the South, there's no compulsory attendance laws. And second of all, the public school, remember, the idea of the public school is a Protestantizing device. This comes in even much more now with progressives. If you can't get the Catholic adults are hopeless and steeped in sin, therefore get the kids, okay? Christianize the Catholics, as they call. You force the kids into the public school system and then Protestantize them to the public schools. So there's a big drive for expansion of the public school system in New York and the South and every place else. Compulsory public school attendance. There's an informal requirement in most jurisdictions. In order to be a public school teacher, you had to be a Protestant church member. It was not official, it was unofficial, but just as important. In San Francisco, you had a constant fight for 50 years between the Catholics and the Protestants in San Francisco, control of the public school system, control of the city in general, public schools in particular. And behind the public school drive are the upper class and WASPs, and upper class business people and WASPs. In many places coincidental. So another thing about public school is you force Catholics into it and Christianize them, quote unquote, and two, business people began to use the public schools as a device to socialize their costs. This is an important form of subsidy we have to realize. One way in which the government subsidizes business is by socializing the cost of business. In other words, taking over some of the costs and loading it onto the taxpayer. For example, in the time of slavery in the South, slavery would not have been efficient, would not have been economic, I should say. Because one of the problems of slavery is that slaves tend to run away. You have a problem of slaves running away. You don't have a capital equipment. Okay? Machines don't decide to run away. Slaves do. So in order to minimize the cost of enforcement, the slave masters loaded it onto the shoulders of the average white taxpayer in the South by having so-called slave patrols. A slave patrol draft. Every Southerner was required to join a slave patrol for 2 weeks out of a year or something. Slave patrols would patrol the roads at night and catch slaves who would run away. A slave patrol had like 5 people on the patrol. Every black person had to have an identity card, something like South Africa. In other words, you have to have an ID card, in this case from your master, telling you where to go, allowing you to go on this particular road. If you didn't have an ID card from your master, you were immediately seized if they didn't know who your slave master was, the slave patrol people were drafted, by the way. Okay. But the way they got their jollies was, every once in a while they find a slave who didn't have an ID card. They didn't know who the slave master was, and they would then own the slave. They'd assume homestead ownership over the slave and sell the slave at auction and get the proceeds. This is the way they got their little boodle, part of the loot. So in the same way, in a sense, the same way that the slave masters were able to load the slave patrol costs onto the shoulders of the average white person in the South, in the same way, the public school system socialized a lot of business costs. For example, businessmen began to want to send a lot of salesmen to South America. They said, why don't they get their businessmen to learn Spanish? Well, how do they get the guy to learn Spanish? You either have to train them themselves at their own cost, or else you get the public school system to teach them Spanish. What the hell? Load the cost onto the taxpayer. So the national NAM and other business groups began to agitate that public schools should teach Spanish, so that then they can take the guy who's already trained in Spanish. You're loading the cost onto the taxpayer is what it amounts to. So with all this, and in addition to this, you have the professional educationists, who John Dewey and other so-called progressives, who are talking about the new theory of progressive education. Every individual, instead of becoming an individual, learns to be part of a group, part of a collective, so to speak, and fits into the collective. And this, of course, suited very well this new kind of progressive doctrine. You fit into the collective, whatever it is, government or business agency, without causing any trouble. So you have a whole municipal reform movement. And part of the public school movement, by the way, see, in the old days, public school used to be decentralized. The school boards were voted on by each neighborhood. The parents of each neighborhood, they would vote for the school board in that neighborhood. This is the general way in which most schools were operated. This was considered inefficient, too democratic, too much control of the parents. The theory of progressive educators was only educationists know how to teach a kid. Parents know nothing. Educationists know everything, because they got a PhD in education, teachers college. Okay? So you have a total graph for power on the part of the educationists, and part of the graph of power was that you minimize the voting procedure. First of all, you have huge school board covering the whole city, okay? And the school board hopefully appointed by the superintendent of schools, or appointed by the mayor, let's say, excuse me, and the superintendent. So this eliminates the parents' role altogether. In other words, the whole idea was to have huge districts, where the parents wouldn't know who the administrators are anyway, and have the mayor, you have to elect the mayor, no way to get around that, but you have everything then appointed by the mayor. The mayor appoints the superintendent, the school board, and all that. Everything becomes a cozy, technocratic thing with the parents having no say in the matter. This, of course, is what happened after 1900. It's probably a progressive situation. In the 1960s, there was a slight move away from this, in the so-called New Left period, where in New York, for example, we now have regional school parent elections with after tremendous blockage, tremendous opposition by the entrenched teachers' unions, who were, of course, battling this to the hilt. But at any rate, this is an ideological drive in the name of so-called value-free science, value-free education, to grab control of the kids on the part of the professional educationists, who are in with upper-class WASP types. This whole thing fitted in beautifully. Also, another thing about urban reform is, in addition to city manager, before 1900, you had the ward district. For example, the legislature in New York City was a so-called board of aldermen. And you had each small neighborhood would have its own alderman. You had like 400 people on the board of aldermen. It means that everybody more or less knew their alderman. So you have a certain amount of democratic check on the situation. You can put pressure on your alderman. You knew who he was, and you put pressure on him. In order to take power out of the hands of ethnic, liturgical, Irish, Italian, etc. ethnics, in the name of so-called efficiency, the progressives then changed all that to make very big, very small city council. Instead of 400 people, you have 20 people. Okay? You reduce that, and you run them preferably at large for the whole city. So nobody knows, first of all, nobody knows any of your representatives. And second of all, it's very costly to run an at-large election. It means to run for a whole New York or whole San Francisco costs a lot of money. You have to be quite wealthy or have wealthy backers to do it. To run from East Bay Ridge costs very little. To run from the whole city costs a lot. In this way, they deliberately got rid of most of the working class, poor working class, and ethnic supporters, or ethnic administrators, and shifted the control of the city to a few upper-class WASP businessmen. This is all done deliberately. In other words, I'll quote a few things, but Weinstein has a lot of this, and there are other sources if you're interested. There's all sorts of data on this thing. This was done in Pittsburgh and Des Moines, etc. There are data about how originally, say, Pittsburgh had a lot of working class aldermen. Then they shift this thing, and you wind up with a few upper class businessmen upper class physicians as the in the name again of efficiency. So this is done in all over, in Rochester. George Eastman does it, Eastman Kodak sets up a Bureau of Municipal Research in the name of so-called good government, business-like efficiency. It's all done in order to shift the political power from working class liturgicals and liturgical machines to upper class businessmen. It all fits, the ethnic and the economic all fit in. In Pittsburgh, for example, the drive for so-called reform was led by the Civic Club and the Voters League, which were both upper-class WASP groups, and essentially businessmen, bankers, corporate officials, and their wives and physicians. There's usually one or two kept physicians in this group who come in as the allies. So in general, before the progressive reforms, cities were decentralized. There were confederations of local wards. They were quite democratic. There were local working class representatives and middle class representatives. In Pittsburgh, for example, in 1910, before the reform period, the city council consisted of about 300 members or so, of which 2/3 were small businessmen or workers. In other words, 2/3 were either employed clerks, laborers, or grocers, and things like that. After the reform movement took over, you have almost all were big businessmen, professional managers, and WASP types. There's all sorts of data on this to deal with. It happens in city after city, Pittsburgh and Galveston and Dayton, et cetera, et cetera. In Pittsburgh, many of these cities didn't want to have a city manager reform. What they did is in the United States, what you have to realize is that cities are a pure tool of the state. I mean, constitutionally, the state has total power over every city within the state. So in Pennsylvania, for example, when Pittsburgh resisted the idea of this progressive reform, the Pennsylvania legislature simply ordered Pittsburgh to do it. They just took over Pittsburgh. They seized Pittsburgh, kicked out the mayor, kicked out the school board, and put in their own people. So, for example, Pittsburgh got dominated by the governor simply kicked out the city council, appointed a new city council based on this at-large voting. And of the 9 people in it, they had 6 upper-class businessmen and 2 upper-class doctors, and 1 kept union official. And the school board the state appointed, in order to change this whole school board thing, they again had 10 big businessmen, 1 upper-class doctor, and 1 kept union official. So it's totally different from the way it had been elected before that. Now, one of the ways in which they did this, one of the areas of agitation was so-called corruption, reform versus corruption, so one thing we have to realize is this is really an ideological. It was an ideological attack on the big city machines, which are quote corrupt unquote. Actually, they're no more corrupt than others; they're just more visible. I mean, for example, if some small town in upstate New York is corrupt, it's very small. If New York City is corrupt, as we've seen recently, it's huge. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars get siphoned off. So big city corruption is more visible, and it's more visible in another sense. See, the guys who are doing it, if you have a reform group, you give a business a contract above cost, it's less visible than, say, somebody like Lindenauer just taking money out of the till. It's more raffish in the case of Lindenauer. It's more visible, so to speak. It's less smooth, put it that way. So we have then is the use by the reformers of the corruption charge, much of which is, I think, it's misfiring. For example, in New York, in the big business machines in the 1900s or so, instead of having a big welfare system, you had a lot of poor people. You had more poor people than you have now, proportionally. You didn't have any welfare state. What you had was Tammany Hall, let's say, which is the New York Manhattan Democratic Party, known as Tammany Hall. The way they would take care of the poor is they have like a private welfare mechanism by the political party structure. In other words, they give away free turkeys at Christmas or Thanksgiving. They have big, turkey dinners for the poor, handled by the Democratic Party, local Democratic Party. It's kind of lovable. This So you have a sort of a private welfare state organized by the Democratic Party. And this way, of course, they buy the vote. In other words, the people would be grateful to the local Democratic Party and vote Democratic. In a sense, there's nothing much wrong with that. It's sort of like a tit-for-tat situation where they fix traffic tickets. When I was growing up, for example, a local Democratic clubhouse person would fix traffic tickets and also fix jury service. He didn't want a jury summons. He handed your local Democratic leader, and he would quote, take care, unquote, the jury summons. This is, I suppose, corruption. It's also helpful corruption. It's helpful to the public. It's getting the public off their neck. And also alleviating poverty, to many extent, out of essentially non-governmental, at least it's not funded by the taxpayer. It's funds in general, I guess, from government office. So it's kind of a raffish kind of corruption, which is not really as unfortunate, I think, as non-corrupt big government, so to speak. In other words, there's worse things in the world than corruption. One of them is incorruptible government. In communist countries now, for example, the only way they can operate at all is by having a huge amount of corruption, by bribery and so forth. If they didn't have any bribery, the whole country would fall apart. They wouldn't be able to produce anything. So it's a question of which you choose. Another thing they did was, as a result of this reform government, they had a much bigger government pool of taxes to have municipal garbage disposal, municipal construction, new sewers, new bridges, contracts for businessmen, and much more money to play around with. Welfare departments, playgrounds, all these things now come in with so-called non-corrupt reform governments. In other words, reform government turns out to be a much bigger government than non-reform. I'll just give you one quote before the break. H.L. Mencken, my favorite writer, was a German-American growing up in Baltimore, had a great story in his autobiography of his attitude to reform, he said, was set by when his father was a small cigar manufacturer in Baltimore, had an experience with corruption, quote, corruption, unquote, reform, unquote. He said his father had a cigar factory in Baltimore. He hung out a sign in 1885 outside the factory saying, August Mencken and Brothers. He called in his corrupt city councilman, so-called corrupt city councilman. He said, look, here's $20. For $20, you keep the government off my neck forever. In other words, the agreement was you pay the city councilman $20, in return for which he takes care of all easements, fees, license requirements, all the rest of this crap. As Mencken said, this is in full settlement forevermore of all present and privilege fees, all permit and privilege fees, easement taxes, and other such costs and imposts. The city councilman pocketed the money. In return, was supposed to stave off any cops, building inspectors, or other functionaries who had any lawful interest in the matter, or try to horn in for private profit. Being an honorable man according to his lights, he, that means the city councilman, kept his bargain, and the sign flapped and squeaked in the breeze for 10 years. In other words, from 1885 to 1895, Mencken and company was free of all government fees, because the city councilman pocketed $20 and kept the government off his neck. Then he says in 1895, a reform wave struck Baltimore, and the reformers came in, the city councilman was kicked out, and, quote, the idealists in the city hall sent word that a license to maintain the sign would cost $62.75 a year. In other words, he had paid $20 for 10 years, essentially. It would now cost $62.75 a year. This was proof to the sign came down the next day. This was proof to my father that reform was mainly only a conspiracy of prehensile charlatans to mulct the taxpayers. And Mencken says that, and he believed that political corruption was inevitable in a democracy, and was even argued out of his own experience that it had its uses. So anyway, this was Mencken's view of the reform movement. I think he was right. And the urban reform front since in the cities WASPs are on a minority after all, and liturgicals and working class are majority. The way in which the reformers, which is almost always upper class WASP, the way they can win out from time to time is by using moral arguments, by saying that the big city machines are corrupt, they're boss-ridden. It's true they're corrupt and boss-ridden, but there are things worse than boss-ridden corruption, namely reformers, and alleged efficiency, which really winds up with tremendously increased raids on the taxpayer. Plus, of course, pietist elimination or wiping out of entrepreneurial activities like gambling, prostitution, etc. So one of the things which reformers use, one of their moral arguments, is attack on so-called organized crime. And there's a very interesting article in the Journal of American History I recommend in December 1970 called Urban Crime and Criminal Justice, the Chicago case, which really deals with how the whole class struggle around organized crime, with the reformers using of course, the argument of the ethnic bosses or illegal organized crime, and using this as an argument to have state corporatist control over the city. And this turns out, for example, in the legal profession, the corporate lawyers, a big class struggle between the corporate lawyers and the criminal lawyers. The corporate lawyers, of course, the elite in the law and legal profession. They make a lot more money than Wall Street law firms. The criminal lawyers tend to be less polished. They're raffish types, often in Brooklyn, and they're less suave, etc. And they're attacked as being affiliated with organized crime. Of course, everybody's entitled to a lawyer. So if somebody is a criminal up for indictment, he's going to turn to some lawyer or other, and criminal lawyers, therefore, often tarred with a brush of being quasi-criminal themselves. It seems to me unfair, since everybody's entitled to some lawyer. And so, but as a matter of fact, there's now a drive on by the legal profession to limit the fees that criminal lawyers get, to put a cap. Of course, they're not putting any cap on corporate lawyers. It's all part of this class struggle, so to speak, between WASP business corporate types and more raffish ethnic types. I remember at one point, about 20 years ago, Jacob Fuchsberg was a distinguished criminal lawyer in New York, ran for the State Court of Appeals, which is the highest New York State judicial arm, and he was bitterly attacked by the entire corporate law profession. He was very upset that he's a criminal lawyer. He has no business in it. I mean, the Court of Appeals people should always be corporate and Wall Street lawyers. Well, there's no divine commandment that has to be a corporate lawyer, but there's a big fight against them. And one of the ways in which the WASP reformers can use their moral outlet is the media, of course. The media is usually, of course, WASP controlled. And so what you have then in the cities, New York, Chicago, etc., whatever, the reformers are pushed by the New York Times, let's say, which is not WASP, but is a typical reformer outfit. And so you have then prestige or respectable newspaper behind the reformers. In New York, for example, which is, of course, largely a Democratic Party city, was run by a reform fusion ticket for about all during the 1930s. Mayor LaGuardia was elected by a Republican fusion government, fusion party, and coming in on the wave of so-called reform. To get even more ethnic here, it's interesting that the Italian Americans, for example, have been very difficult to make it politically until very, very recently, of course, with Cuomo. Before that, in New York State, the only Italians, Americans who succeeded politically were Protestant Italians. That's a very small percentage of the Italian American population is Protestant. You can imagine, maybe 1%. But somehow, the Italian Americans in politics who made it politically until very recently were Protestant. LaGuardia and Procora, people like that who Italian Protestants, therefore, coming from a very small percentage of the Italian population, not really in with basic Italian Americans. So, of course, we're Catholic. So again, this is all part of the WASP versus Catholic and High Lutheran struggle. And again, an attack, since big city machines were basically Irish, I said, after 1900 or so, where the Protestant WASPs were kicked out, and so you had basically old Calvinist WASP, basically had city machines were Irish, and so an attack on the big city bosses essentially was an anti-Irish or anti-Catholic assault in the name of so-called reform. So what you had then is the reformers were able to capture the high moral ground. There's very few people who can take a sophisticated argument in favor of corruption. The argument basically is the Mencken argument. It's better to be corrupt than have an efficient, high-tax government. It's very difficult to make that argument, and basically, so the reformers then can use the media, the press, etc., taking a high moral tone and attacking everybody else as being immoral, which is basically their view. Also, along with this comes upper-class WASP moral moral theorists, so to speak, upper-class females who start running around 1900 the social work movement, social worker settlement house movement. Jane Addams, people like that who were a whole bunch of philosopher reformers. Jane Addams of Chicago, Seth Low in New York, a whole bunch. Jacob Riis Housing. All these people were upper-class WASP millionaires, and Jane Addams was the daughter of an upper-class WASP millionaire, coming in to help uplift the poor. It was known those days as uplift. In other words, you are upper-class females, let's say, coming in and uplifting the Lower East Side. How do you uplift? Well, of course, you hand out food and so forth. But basically, the uplift is also using compulsion, forcing, kicking out, getting rid of sweatshop employers, which really meant getting rid of employers, getting rid of conditions they didn't like, getting rid of prostitution, saloons. Prohibition comes in beautifully. All these people were prohibitionists. And prohibition was part of the idea of uplifting the poor. You uplift the poor by stamping out immoral conditions. Immoral conditions meant liquor, saloon, prostitution, pornography, whatever. So all this was part of the moral reform movement, part of the progressive seizure of power on a local level. Another way to do this is known as urban imperialism. This is something which is very little known. I know of only one book that really mentions this in any length, Milton Kotler, in one book called Neighborhood Government. One of the ways in which the cities grew in this period is by seizing power over the other areas. In other words, much of the urban political growth, urban population growth from 1900 to 1910 was not growth by people being born or people migrating. It was growth in the sense of seizing control over it by expanding the city geography. In other words, originally in 1900, New York City was Manhattan, okay? And then Brooklyn was its own city. Actually, Brooklyn was a combination of a whole bunch of different cities. Flatbush, New Dorp, all these were originally cities, you say. Brooklyn was the fourth largest city in the United States in 1900. It was seized by New York. Manhattan had conquered the Bronx by that time. And seized in this sense, compulsorily seizure. Brooklyn did not want to be amalgamated to New York. So New York went to the New York State Legislature. New York State Legislature forced Brooklyn into it. In other words, the state legislature, remember, was all powerful. And so this happened in Philadelphia, it happened in Pittsburgh, where the cities would just simply incorporate areas, other cities around it. Philadelphia crushed Germantown, seized Germantown by using the Pennsylvania legislature. In other words, these cities, Brooklyn did not want to be incorporated into New York. Germantown did not want to be incorporated into Philadelphia. It's simply they use the state legislature to force these other cities into it. It's been called urban imperialism over its neighbors. I think it's what the heck, it's a pretty good term here. By urban, so what was the accomplishment here? What they did is you bring in more tax revenue. In other words, many of these areas, for example in Pittsburgh, which grabbed a whole bunch of neighboring cities, and there was more. These cities, these downtowns, for example, let's take Pittsburgh, was originally built around the railroad terminals. Okay? In other words, before automobiles came in and trucks came in, the city you had a railroad terminal, and cities were built around it. You had factories and people living there, etc. So the downtowns were heavily indebted and with railroad bonds and so forth, subsidized railroads. They're paying heavy taxes on these bonds. So if you grab a whole bunch of other cities around it, incorporate it into Pittsburgh, then you can tax these guys to pay for the railroad bonds. That's essentially what happened. In other words, he used this downtown interest, downtown businessmen are heading up the inner city, seize power in the suburbs, bring them into the city, and then tax them. That's basically the point. Assess these buildings at a higher rate, so forth and so on. So, and essentially New York is the same thing to Brooklyn and the Bronx, which was really part of Westchester. This happened a lot between 1900 and 1910. This growth of urban imperialism that annex neighboring towns, neighboring cities, bring them into the tax base. There has been for many years now the so-called metro movement. The idea is to grab Westchester, let's say, and grab parts of Nassau, force them into New York City and tax them. In other words, it's really just a tax gimmick to bring these poor guys into a higher tax bracket and get downtown New York for the subsidies. So, so anyway, this process happened during the 19th century, but in this progressive period it reached its peak. Okay. So they deliberately, for example, in Pittsburgh, they deliberately taxed the other wards much more heavily than the downtown wards. Much higher assessment per dollar property on the outlying wards that they were taking over. In Pittsburgh, for example, in 1912, after the compulsory seizure of Allegheny and other towns incorporated into Pittsburgh, the old rate, well, in one case, Boxhoven, which was a new town incorporated into Pittsburgh, was paying 90 times the property tax, than the old third ward, the old downtown third ward. That's, of course, very unusual. It's usually not that big a range. But basically, that's what happens. You take the new ward, you tax them more heavily than the old one, and thereby subsidize the downtown, heavily debt-ridden downtown area. Brooklyn was annexed in 1898 by the New York City collaboration of New York State Legislature. So, for example, Pittsburgh grew from 1900 to 1910, grew from a population of 320,000 to 530,000, largely by incorporating other areas, not by real growth. Doesn't mean it really grew, in the sense of growth per mile, simply just by incorporating other regions into Pittsburgh. And as this happened, as the cities got larger and larger, it meant that as the city councils got smaller, remember, because they're being voted on at large, and school boards got smaller and at large, it meant that the representatives per person got less and less. In other words, the cities got larger, the city councils got smaller in number and larger and representing more people. You wind up with less and less democratic voting. You have fewer and fewer government officials per person in the city council. For example, in the Columbus, Ohio, for example, in the 1830s had one city council member for every 100 people. They had 2,000 people and 20 city councilmen. So, and that's the situation. Everybody obviously knew their city councilman. I could more or less ride herd over them. Jimmy is goofing up, get him to change his vote, pay him a visit. By the current period, Columbus, Ohio has 500,000 people. Right? Instead of 2,000, and has 9 city councilmen. So you have one city councilman for every 50,000 people instead of for every 20 people, and for every 100. You obviously have much smaller representation per person than you had before. Anyway, to get back to the social work movement, which becomes a professional uplift movement around 1900, with Jane Addams, who was the daughter of one of the richest men in Illinois, Mary Kingsley, same way, a whole bunch of them, Lillian Wall and the Henry Street Settlement, and again, bringing in professional social work, trying to stamp out alleged immorality, and making social work from a charitable thing into a profession, people living off of. And many of the New Deal officials in the 1930s came out of the social work movement. Most of the women New Dealers, for example, were originally upper class social workers in this Hull House, Settlement House movement. Eleanor Roosevelt came out of that, and Francis Perkins, Secretary of Labor, and a whole bunch of others. Part of the public school reform movement was to also run the whole kit. In other words, the idea of school reform, not just to Christianize the Catholics and yeah.
The urban bureaus have a lot of effect on the state.
Beg pardon?
The urban bureaus have an effect on the state.
Yeah, I would say so, sure.
And that's between 1900 and 1910.
Yeah.
Was there a government subsidy for people, or welfare state? Did you have something like that during that time?
Not much. There was some, yeah. There's not much. That really comes in the 1930s.
Taking a larger area.
Yeah.
Take the area of your own state. There needs taxes and increase.
Yeah.
But the government will have to pay some amount of money. People
Well, most of it was still, it really comes in the 1930s, the welfare state. And then it was mostly, a lot of course, workmen's compensation. There was public works, there was, building of sewers and stuff like that. Not too much. The welfare system, the government welfare system really comes in the 30s. That's not really before. But the 30s were really an extension, the New Deal was really an extension of the progressive period, really just a bigger progressive period, rather than amounts to. It was a similar system, except more of it than it amounts to. Again, with the schools, the cry was take the schools out of politics, you say. In other words, don't have people voting for school boards, have it appointed by the mayor, have professional educationists do it. As one historian says, the reformers' battle cry, take the school out of politics, not only meant take the schools out of the hands of Tammany Hall, but also out of the hands of the Roman Catholic Church. In other words, the idea was you make it into a Protestantizing device. And you take it out of the hands of the ward boss and into the hands of the technocratic educationists. And also the idea is you run the whole kid. In other words, the educationists had the idea the whole kid should be molded by the professional educators. And molded into the system, molded in how to conform and so forth and so on, which is essentially what they did. Also, from this came the idea of reducing content of the schools and making it into a sort of a general socializing device. Elwood Cubberley, who was the major historian of education, a big educationist, big progressive educator, summed it all up in 1916, summed up the idea of school reform, and he said, one of the important results of the change from ward representation to election from the city at large is that the inevitable representatives from these poor wards is eliminated, representation is eliminated, and the board comes to partake of the best characteristics of the city as a whole. I mean, of course, the upper class pietists. What he called the better elements. Who he said are the better elements who are now making up the school board? Quote, men who are successful in their handling of large business undertakings, manufacturers, merchants, bankers, contractors, and professional men of large practice. I mean, of course, doctors would perhaps come first. This is an open recognition that the whole idea of the school reform is to take over, seize the control of the schools from the hands of ethnic people's representatives to technocrats and big businessmen. And also to take these new immigrants, mostly Catholic, and homogenize them into becoming good Protestants, as far as possible, of course. Prohibition was a great example, a marvelous example of the combination of the moral uplift, pseudo-science, pseudo-value-free science, technocracy, and smashing the ethnic politics, liturgical politics. Now, all these guys combined on the drive for prohibition, which only first gets here in World War I, but is revved up during the progressive period. Businessmen, big businessmen attacked the idea of liquor as, quote, an enemy of efficiency. In other words, the workers are allowed to drink, they get drunk, and then the absenteeism goes up, I suppose at night. So therefore, if we prevent the workers from getting drunk by eliminating alcohol, outlawing alcohol. You notice, for example, in Disney World, it's a beautiful example of the best and worst of WASP capitalism. Disney, if you've ever been to Disney World, it's a magnificently run, beautifully run outfit. I mean, everything is private, of course. The sewers are private, the streets are private. Everything works beautifully. I mean, everything. The bathrooms are spick and span. It's all great. However, you can't get any liquor there. Liquor is, if you wander around Disney World forever, you get non-alcoholic punch. Okay. Because liquor, of course, all these people still have this pietist view that somehow liquor is, if you have liquor at all, it should only be for the wealthy. The masses shouldn't be allowed to drink. And so you can drink liquor by checking in a Disney World hotel, and there you have a cocktail lounge which does have liquor. But the masses, I mean, the rest of us are wandering around the streets there, can't get any liquor. It's great except for that. Of course, it's a real blight. George Pullman had his own private, the founder of Pullman Cars, was a progressive businessman. He had his own city, Pullman, Illinois, now part of Chicago, for the workers. The idea was the workers would live there and rent houses. His workers would live in Pullman, Illinois, and rent his houses. And and it was supposed to be a well-planned city, sort of a privately planned city for his workers. Unfortunately, what happened was that he engaged in pietist moral domination of these people. In other words, there'd be Gestapo-type checks, raids on every home, and make sure everybody walking around with jackets. The men were always supposed to wear jackets at all times, not be in shirt sleeves. So to prevent shirt sleeves, there'd be raids on the porch, and, busting on the home, make sure everybody's got jackets on. Of course, there was no liquor available, no pornography, of course, and no liquor was available in all of Pullman, Illinois. So the masses began to get restless, edgy as a result. They'd sneak across the border to free, whatever the name is, Decatur, Illinois, to get liquor, and all the other sinful delights of big cities. And the famous strike of the Pullman Railroad workers in the 1890s was basically a result of this, the living conditions getting more and more edgy and restless under this moral domination of this creep who's trying to uplift them and shape them up. So you had then you have the efficiency argument that workers shouldn't be allowed to drink because otherwise they have absenteeism. The moral argument that liquor is sinful. And for example, Walter Rauschenbusch, the famous social gospeler, the head of the social gospel movement, said, quote, "The liquor industry is," 1912, he wrote a book called Christianizing the Social Order. Very interesting title, Christianizing the Social Order. He said, quote, "The liquor industry is seeking to fasten on an angry people a relic of barbarism, which the awakened conscience and the scientific intellect of the world are combining to condemn. The awakened moral conscience against liquor and scientific intellect." Why should the scientific intellect? Because liquor is unscientific. Liquor leads to absenteeism, it leads to liver trouble. Well, there's lots of arguments against liquor. It makes fun. Nowadays, there's a return of prohibition sentiment. You drink liquor, it tends to have car accidents. Okay, so therefore, ban liquor. That seems to be the conclusion. So as a result, you have this mighty prohibitionist movement on religious grounds and on so-called scientific grounds. And the scientists were usually also WASP pietists. In other words, the one hat was WASP pietists, and the other hat they were value-free scientists saying we should outlaw liquor because liquor will lead to more accidents and liver trouble and God knows what. And particularly, this of course was an assault on German Lutheran and Catholic beer drinking. and this is a fantastic clash over beer. The Germans love beer, and beer was part of alcoholic beverages. It was a fantastic clash over that. Reverend Josiah Strong, social gospeler, prominent social gospel person, said in 1909 that high wages are bad because you buy drink with them and acquire the liquor habit before the workers have developed a more refined taste of a higher civilization. In other words, the workers aren't ready for high wages yet because they'll drink. They have more refined taste eventually. I don't know what they'd be doing with refined taste. Anyway, Strong also attacked what he called personal liberty in 1914. He said, quote, this is a fascinating quote, he said, "Personal liberty is at last," after many years of progressivism, "personal liberty is at last an uncrowned, dethroned king with no one to do him reverence. We are no longer frightened by that ancient bogey paternalism in government," which of course the liturgicals have been attacking for decades. "We affirm boldly it is the business of government to be just that, paternal. Nothing human can be foreign to a true government," unquote. It was a function of government to run everything, regulate everything, probe in everybody's life. The scientific argument, which went along with the so-called scientific argument for liquor, for prohibition, is, of course, that it says the uplift, the poor are now being destroyed by liquor, we should therefore outlaw it. It has harmful effects. If people drink too much, they liver trouble, whatever. And since according to the new so-called scientists, people are determined by their environment, therefore you have to change the environment. How do you change the environment? You eliminate liquor. Because part of people's evil environment is the ability to buy liquor. So all these pseudo-scientific arguments are being called into being here. Plus progressive sociologists and social scientists like Edward A. Ross, one of my least favorite people. He was a disciple of Commons and Ely. Edward Oldsworth Ross, professor of sociology at University of Wisconsin. Also a big racist. You have to realize that allegedly scientific racism now comes in here as part of the progressive movement. All these Wisconsin people had it. They believe that non-Anglo-Saxons were inferior races, most, of course, including Italians, Poles, Irish, etc., who are Catholics. It all tends to fit in, you see. Other races are inferior and should be kept out of, and should be, of course, not allowed to immigrate to the United States. As part of the immigration restriction movement, which is also an attack on liturgicals, it now gets a scientific patina as being determined by biology, by social Darwinism biology. So biology is now brought in as an allegedly scientific reason to eliminate immigration of Catholic and Jews later and so forth countries. Ross is one of the leading figures in this, as well as advocating state control of almost everything. The economic argument that says it's necessary for workers to be sober. If you allow them to drink, they'll be absent more. And another thing is that the drive for prohibition came about because the railroads were getting to be liable. Liability laws were coming in. The railroads were liable for accidents caused by their engineers or firemen or whatever. So if you're a switchman, if you have the wrong switch and you have an accident, the railroads became liable. The railroads now wanted to start making rules that their engineers or whatever can't drink even off duty. It's like pilots now can't drink, I think, 12 hours before they fly or something, that sort of thing. So the railroads began to enforce temperance on their own employees, and then of course they said, well, look, if we have temperance voluntarily, let's get the government to pass compulsory temperance for our competitors. So, so therefore, they start agitating for prohibition. Another group in favor of prohibition, I kid you not, was the Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola in those days was a big competitor to alcohol, had some cocaine in it. That, by the way, was the origin of the word coca, from the coca leaf. Had a little bit of cocaine in it, which apparently gave you a certain kick. It's disappeared long since from the formula. So Coca-Cola were big competitors to liquor. Coca-Cola was one of the main agitators for prohibition. You outlaw your competitor, these people have to turn to Coke for getting the missing kick. Well, another big lobbyist in favor of prohibition was Welch's grape juice, which of course came in communion when wine was outlawed. They turned to Welch's grape juice. By the way, grape juice, most Protestant churches already had Welch's grape juice as the communion drink. So Welch's grape juice is a big competitor to wine. They were lobbying for prohibition. Two prominent business lobbyists for prohibition, eliminate their competition. The Catholics, of course, and Lutherans were heavily against prohibition. The Catholic businessmen like DuPont were leading the fight against prohibition and were during the 1930s. The unions were sort of split. They didn't know what to do. Most unions, or WASP unions, were in favor of prohibition. Socialist unions, Knights of Labor originally. The Railroad Brotherhoods were in favor of prohibition. On the other hand, of course, the brewery workers were also unionized. And they were, of course, against prohibition. It means their livelihood would be taken away from them. Distillery and brewery workers. So the AFL was sort of split. They didn't take an official position on it because they had brewery workers. But most of the socialists and labor union people were in favor of prohibition. They attacked the liquor industry. They took the usual leftist line that somehow businessmen were creating demand. So if people wanted liquor, it wasn't their fault because the evil businessmen were supplying them with alcohol. And so therefore the liquor, you have to attack the liquor lobby. And social workers, of course, were all in favor of abolishing the saloon. Here's a great quote from a prominent social worker, Paul Benjamin, who wrote in the Survey magazine, which is one of the big progressive publications, in 1915. He said, "Abolish the saloon, quote, and the task of Americanizing the conglomerate foreign population will be lightened by 50%, unquote. In other words, Americanizing meaning making good Protestants out of them, is what it really amounts to. So again, it's all part of the same sort of shtick. And as World War I begins to loom, and America begins to join the war effort, anti-German hysteria becomes part of the argument for prohibition. As we'll see later, one of the great quotes was that the biggest German agents in this country, the most important German agents, are not spies, but their names are Schlitz, Bush, Budweiser, whatever, Pabst, Miller. In other words, the German brewers, who are subverting American boys by subverting their moral fiber and supplying them with beer. The Anti-Saloon League said, quote, "The German brewers in this country have rendered thousands of men inefficient and are thus crippling the Republic in its war against Prussian militarism." Unquote. So, in other words, the war, the entry into World War I, supplied the final push over the top. The anti-German hysteria, and therefore the anti-beer hysteria along with it, provided the opportunity for the Democratic Party to impose prohibition, notice. As we'll see, Wilson, by this time, of course, was a progressive, and oddly enough, prohibition comes to the United States as a democratic maneuver during World War I. Actually, it comes, excuse was American boys, American soldiers have to be protected from liquor. And so first they sort of made all bars off limits and so forth. Then they decided, well, the best way to do it is to eliminate liquor altogether by outlawing it and making it unconstitutional. So that as a result of World War I, liquor becomes an insane thing, a constitutional amendment saying that all liquor is outlawed, both the possession and the sale and production of liquor becomes unconstitutional. I mean, it's incredible it could even be a constitutional amendment, but that's the way it was as a result of World War I. One prohibitionist said, this is the quote, "We have German enemies in this country too. I mean, the worst of all German enemies, the most treacherous, the most menacing are Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, and Miller." These are the beer, of course, the big beer manufacturers. Okay, so this is, we'll start next time by talking about the way the medical profession was screwed up by progressivism. Okay.